Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 184 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Early North America was a place rife with violent conflict. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, we find a lot of conflict between different Native American peoples and colonists, colonists from one European empire versus the colonists from another European empire, settlers from one American state versus settlers from another American state. Plus, in the 19th century, we also see a lot of conflict between Americans, Native Americans, Canadians, and Mexicans. Today, we're going to explore some of the causes of the violent conflicts that took place in early America by looking specifically at Native America and the ways that Native Americans used guns to shape their lives in the course of North American colonial and indigenous history. Our guide for this exploration is David J. Silverman, a professor of history at George Washington University and the author of Thundersticks: Firearms and the Violent Transformation of Native America. Now, during our investigation of Native America, David reveals information about the arrival of guns in early America and Native Americans' initial interest in them, details about Native Americans' trade for guns, and the ways Native Americans use guns to revolutionize their lives. But first, I just wanted to thank you for attending our listener meetups in Sacramento, California and Las Vegas, Nevada a couple of weeks ago. I really enjoyed meeting you and getting to know more about you and your interests. It's always fun for me to meet new people and to connect real people to all the email addresses and social media accounts I interact with. So thank you for coming out, and we'll definitely do it again in Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Boston this summer. Okay, ready to explore how Native Americans use guns to shape their lives? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at George Washington University. He's a specialist in Native American and colonial American history, and an award-winning scholar who has written 4 books, including Red Brethren, The Brothertown and Stockbridge Indians, and the Problem of Race in Early America, and, most recently, Thundersticks: Firearms and the Violent Transformation of Native America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, David Silverman.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thundersticks is an exploration into how and why one group of Native Americans after another used firearms to revolutionize their lives between the 17th and 19th centuries. David, it seems like we should start our conversation about Native Americans' historic use of guns with the arrival of guns in North America. So, would you tell us a bit about when guns arrived on the continent and when Native Americans started to take notice of them?
Sure. It's safe to assume that guns arrived with the very first explorers, and certainly in the very first colonies. And we know from written accounts of these expeditions that Native people took notice of firearms right from the very beginning. To give you an example, we see from the Lost Roanoke colony that indigenous people along the coast of North Carolina very quickly took notice of guns and linked the firing of those weapons to the onset of epidemic diseases among them. So right away, they're interested in these weapons. We also see in Jamestown colony that Wahunsinacock, or Powhatan, the Indian leader of the native people of Lower Chesapeake Bay, started to demand firearms in trade almost from the outset. So Native people notice these guns right away, take an interest in them right away, and want to acquire them right away as well.
Why do you think Native Americans were so interested in guns, and why do you think they sought to acquire them so quickly?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between initial interest and then long-term interest. And I think the reasons for initial interest have attracted the greatest amount of attention from historians, and I think to the detriment of the way we tell the story of Native people and firearms. Historians have always been interested in the ways in which Native people were awed by the pyrotechnics of firearms, by the sound, by the flash, by the smoke. And the assumption has been that Native interest over the long term stemmed from what historians have characterized as a psychological effect in indigenous people. That the awe and terror of these guns was what drew their interest. Now, I have no doubt that initially those features of firearms did indeed draw Native interest. But over the long term, the reason that Native people were interested in acquiring firearms was that they were difference makers in warfare. And for that matter, they were useful tools in hunting. So it was the usefulness of firearms over the long term rather than some kind of psychological effect that explains Native interest in these weapons.
Native Americans were interested in guns because they were difference makers in warfare and useful hunting tools. Additionally, Jared also wonders whether Native Americans were interested in guns because of European diseases. He wonders whether European diseases might have created demographic, economic, and political pressures that, pushed Native Americans to adopt and acquire guns. So what do you think of this, David? Do you think European diseases could have caused some of Native Americans' long-term interest in guns?
Well, there's no question that disease is a driver of Native American warfare. And insofar as it served that function, it also helped to fuel Native interest in the acquisition of firearms. Because as I said, Native people recognized very early on that guns were difference makers in intertribal warfare. What we see in Native America is that among many tribes, the Five Nations Iroquois foremost among them, but this is a rule that applies fairly broadly, that as Native people are losing population to epidemic diseases, they step up raids on other peoples to capture mostly women and children for the purposes of adoption into the tribe in order to sustain and even grow their numbers. Once they acquire guns, the guns become a mechanism by which they can conduct these raids. So yes, there most certainly was a link between disease, Native interest in firearms, and warfare.
I wonder if we could explore if and how Native Americans became connoisseurs of guns, if you will. Because as I found in my own research about the trade that took place between Native Americans and the Dutch, British, and American settlers in early Albany, New York, Native Americans knew exactly what kind of goods they wanted and how they wanted those goods. And they really weren't afraid to ask for the goods that they preferred. So I wonder, did Native American savviness in trade carry over into their desire for guns?
No question about it. And here, too, I think there's been a mistaken impression in literature and in popular culture about Native consumer power in these transactions. There's a widespread assumption that Native people got the worst of European gun technology, that they got third-rate, throwaway muskets and pistols. That's patently untrue. Native power in colonial America, by virtue of Native people's status as the producers of furs and slaves, and their military prowess, and the need of colonies to cultivate Native people as allies, meant that European suppliers of firearms had to respond to Native demands. And what that meant was that Native people got guns that were tailored to their specifications. And what they wanted, this applies across the continent during the entirety of my study, between the 1630s and the late 1800s. What Native people wanted were light, durable firearms at low cost. What's more, they also got certain details added to these guns in accordance with their specifications. One of my favorite details is a serpent side plate, basically an ornament to the gun, which one sees first in Dutch trade guns in the 17th century, and then other fur trade firms begin to pick up on this decoration. The French do it, later the Americans do it in the Missouri River Valley, and this becomes a feature of Native trade guns for the better part of 200 years. Native people favored this serpent side plate because they associated firearms with the power of shamans. And shamans in Native American culture derived their power by having a vision of the underwater horned serpent, one of the spirits of the Native American cosmos. What's more, that serpent was associated with the material flint, and flint was used in the firing mechanism of firearms. And then a final connection here between the serpent side plate and Native American cosmology is that the serpent's analog in the native cosmos was the thunderbird, cosmological figure that streaked through the sky, shooting lightning from its eyes. Well, the process of the thunderbird shooting lightning from its eyes was analogous to the pyrotechnics of the firearm. So here we see native cosmology shaping native consumer preferences and in turn shaping the decoration of Native American trade guns. On a more minor note, we see, for instance, in the Northern Plains and Rocky Mountain West, that native trade guns had large trigger guards that could accommodate native warriors and hunters wearing mittens when they were firing them. So in these ways and more, we see native consumer preferences shaping the way that Europeans manufactured guns for the indigenous North American market.
Now, just to explore the actual trade for guns a bit more, in all of the case studies David explores in his book, Thundersticks, Native Americans traded for firearms with multiple European and American groups. David, what did having access to multiple trading partners mean for Native Americans' acquisition of guns? I mean, why did it prove important to have many trade partners?
Well, some of this is just basic consumer power, as any of your listeners will certainly understand from their own shopping. When you can shop at more than one purveyor, you're likelier to get a better deal. Native people were as aware of that as modern-day consumers are. There was a political element to all of this as well. One of the things I assert in Thundersticks is that munitions, guns, powder, and shot, were the only category of European trade good in Native America that we can truly characterize as a need. Now, there's no doubt that Native people traded for a wide variety of European items, cloth and clothing foremost among them, liquor, glass beads, and the like. Native people didn't want to do without those items. They could have done without those items if they wanted to. They weren't going to die without them. But munitions were a necessity. They were a necessity because Native people needed them in order to defend themselves against other gun-toting natives. And thus, to get back to your original question, Native people cultivated multiple sources of supply so they wouldn't be at risk of being cut off from their sources of munitions in the event of wars with those suppliers. And so what one sees is that, for instance, in the Native Northeast, Native peoples opened up trade lines to the Dutch, the English, the French, with different colonies of the English Empire. In the Southeast, likewise, Native people opened up trade lines with the Spanish, the French of Louisiana, the English of South Carolina and Virginia. In the lower Mississippi River Valley, they opened up trade lines to the French in Louisiana, the Spanish in Texas and New Mexico, eventually the British and the Americans on the upper Mississippi River. Oft overlooked, and this kind of playoff system is pretty well established in literature, but oft overlooked is the way that indigenous people, particularly those deep in the interior of the continent, where they were far away from centers of European population and power, and sometimes far away even from the nearest trade post, they opened up relations with indigenous middlemen, usually coming from small, relatively less powerful tribes who would tack back and forth between European trade centers and powerful native groups in the interior to ferry European munitions and other trade goods to those interior groups, and in turn to take furs, bison robes, and slaves from those groups and bring them back to European trade centers. And through all of these means, Native people throughout the continent usually were in a position where no one polity could choke them off from their essential supplies of munitions.
Okay, now that we have a baseline for how Native Americans conducted their firearms trade in general, I wonder if we could explore a few of the case studies in your book so that we can get a better feel for how some specific Native American peoples acquired and used their firearms. I think here we should start with the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people you mentioned earlier, as they were one of the first Native American peoples to acquire and adopt European firearms. So David, would you tell us how and why the Haudenosaunee people sought guns and how they used their firearms?
Sure. They sought guns for the same reasons that other Native people in later times did as well. They could see very quickly that these weapons were incredibly powerful and that they could turn the tide of their people's wars with other indigenous nations. And I actually think it's worth pausing on that point. For most Native people, the most immediate use they have for these weapons is in the context of intertribal wars. Eventually, they'll need them for their wars with colonial powers. That's not their main concern initially. So the Haudenosaunee gain early access to these weapons much earlier than other groups, largely because of their connections with the Dutch of New Netherland. Dutch New Netherland was established on the Hudson River, with a political base on the island of Manhattan and a fur trade post on the upper Hudson River on the site of modern-day Albany, which was at the easternmost site of Mohawk territory, the Mohawks being the easternmost nation of the Five Nations Iroquois League. The Dutch realized very quickly that if they're going to establish trade and political alliances with the Haudenosaunee, they're going to have to supply them with the goods that they want. And the goods that these people wanted, above all else, were guns, powder, and shot. The Dutch were in very little position to dictate to these people what they would trade to them. The Dutch recognized that if they didn't provide guns to the Haudenosaunee, then the Haudenosaunee would take their trade elsewhere, particularly to the English of New England and Chesapeake Bay. What's more, there was no way for the Dutch to expect for their fur trade post on the upper Hudson River to survive with the Mohawks abutting them unless they essentially paid rent to the Mohawks, which was to provide them with the trade goods that they wanted, and for that matter, to provide them on a regular basis with free blacksmithing services and gifts of powder and shot. Those were the conditions by which the Haudenosaunee allowed the Dutch to operate on the edges of their territory.
It's really interesting to me that you said the Dutch were really worried that the Haudenosaunee would go off to New England and trade with the New Englanders, or even off to New France and possibly trade with the French. Because it seemed like when I read your book, Thundersticks, that the French were actually really reluctant to trade firearms to the Native Americans, as were the New Englanders. In fact, it seemed like both the French and the New Englanders were peeved at the Dutch for trading firearms to Native Americans like the Haudenosaunee.
Well, here I think we need to make a distinction between statements from English and French authorities and the actual behavior of English and French fur traders. One of the main themes of Thundersticks is that colonial states and European empires, despite their pretensions to power, had very little control over their traders in Indian country. Traders in Indian country want to corner the Indian market. Native furs are among the most lucrative resources in early colonial settings, and in some colonial settings, they're the basis for colonial economies for decades and decades. Think New Netherland, New France, Russia and Alaska, and the like. Thus, they had to respond to their native customers' demands. And as a result, these traders would routinely provide native people with guns, powder, and shot in violation of the laws of their colonies and the laws of their empires, sometimes even under the threat of capital punishment. One normally doesn't think, for instance, of Puritan New Englanders as rogue traders, but there's no question about it that there was a thriving munitions trade in colonial New England, despite the laws of colonies like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth designed to discourage that trade.
So now that we know how the Haudenosaunee sought and traded for firearms, we should really explore how guns changed their very way of life. David, how did guns change the patterns of Haudenosaunee life between the 17th and 18th centuries? And I guess while we're at it, we also need to talk about how the patterns of their neighbors' lives changed too, as the Haudenosaunee possession and use of firearms didn't just impact the Iroquois.
Well, the most fundamental way is that they became the dominant military power in the Northeast in the early to mid 17th century. Over the course of a few decades, they ran over one group after another, mostly Iroquoian-speaking groups of the Great Lakes region, and then expanded their conquests to include the Ohio River Valley, the Susquehanna River Valley, and even as far west as the Ohio, and some of their raids took place just west of the Mississippi River. There's no question that firearms were a key component of their military dominance. generally speaking, the victories that Haudenosaunee people won over these various tribal nations, they came at the expense of peoples who were lightly armed or entirely unarmed. And indeed, I see a strategy in Iroquois strikes of targeting people that they knew did not have access to European firearms. Iroquois or Haudenosaunee military dominance begins to ebb as we get past the halfway mark of the 17th century as other native people begin to close the arms gap. In other words, what we see is a vast regional intertribal arms race in which the Iroquois are dominant at first, but in which they're receiving as much punishment as they're giving as the century wears on.
European firearms also made their way into the hands of Native Americans who lived in the southeastern part of North America, too. Would you tell us about the slave wars that took place in the Southeast during the 17th century and about how Native Americans used these wars to their advantage?
Sure, and there's a connection here to the story of Iroquois military dominance in the early to mid 17th century. So among the peoples that the Iroquois conquered and then displaced were the Eries, who, when we first encountered them in the historical record, were residing on the Great Lakes, on the lake that now bears their name. Their survivors of Iroquois raids moved south, first to Virginia, in what's now Virginia, and eventually into what's now South Carolina, where they established trading relationships with the English colonists of those places. And the trade that they establish is predominantly a trade of human captives, of indigenous captives from other tribal communities in exchange for munitions. What the Eries had concluded was that they were never going to become victims of gun-toting marauders again, as had been the case in their earlier relations with the Haudenosaunee. Hence, this trade to the south. Eventually, these Eries become known as Westos because of their commerce at a trade post on the site of modern-day Richmond, Virginia, which was known as Westover. So the Eries become known as the Westos. Once South Carolina is founded, these Westos direct their slaves for arms traffic to that colony. And there's a good reason for this. One is that Native people within the orbit of Virginia were becoming as equally well-armed as the Westos, thus robbing the Westos of the advantage that they had enjoyed when they first arrived in the territory. But another reason was that there were ample enslavable populations farther to the south, particularly in the case of Native people living within the missions of Spanish Florida. The Spanish were one of the very few empires that managed to do a pretty good job of preventing its people from trading munitions to indigenous people. And thus, you see tens of thousands of Native people living in these mission communities with little to no firearms to protect them. And the Spanish themselves were also underarmed. And so first the Westos and then a succession of other Native people in the Southeast begin targeting these mission communities to seize people to then trade to South Carolina in exchange for munitions. What this does is it creates yet another kind of arms race, not unlike what we saw in Iroquois in the area of Iroquois raids, in which Native people discovered that they have to establish commerce with Europeans to acquire the guns that will protect them from gun-toting marauders. The difference in the Southeast is that this is an exchange not of furs for guns, but of human beings for guns. And so one could either be enslaved in the Southeast or become a slaver to acquire the weapons that one needed both for defense and predation. And so a sequence of militant slaving nations arises in the wake of the original Westo trade. The Savannahs, the Yamasees, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, Cherokees, Catawbas, and still more nations all get enveloped in this trade to the point that between 1680 and 1720, this is a region in which really no one is safe from the threat of enslavement.
What's curious about these Southeastern slaving wars is that between 1710 and 1730, these wars actually transformed into anti-colonial wars. So, David, what changed in these wars, and why did some southeastern Native Americans decide to take an anti-colonial stance while other nations decided to stick by their colonial allies?
There are a couple of things at play here. One is fairly early on, a pattern emerges in which Native people who are the primary slave-raiding allies of European colonies one day find themselves betrayed by those colonies the next, usually when the slaving nation is becoming too strong and begins representing a threat to the interests of the slave-purchasing colony. So, for instance, in the case of the Westos, South Carolina eventually makes an alliance with the Savannahs, or Shawnees, another group which had been displaced by Iroquois raids from the Ohio River Valley, and makes an agreement with them to attack the Westos, attacks which take place with guns supplied by South Carolina. Soon, the Savannahs are being attacked by groups allied with South Carolina, such as the Catawbas. The Yamasees, who appear to be a composite group formed out of survivors from Westo attacks on the missions, are the next group. They form into a militant slaving group. And as we know, in 1715 and 16, they end up at war with South Carolina. So there's this cycle which Native people are picking up on, and they don't want to be next. Their fear that they're next stems from their very successes in the slave trade. Take the Tuscaroras, for instance, who go to war with North Carolina in 1711. They had been early participants in this slave trade, raiding other groups and also allowing their villages to serve as gun trading entrepôts in the trade. Well, by the time we get to 1711, they had effectively out-hunted the surrounding territory of human beings to capture as slaves. The only remaining groups were now as well armed as they. It was too risky a venture to try to enslave them. But at the same time, they needed to keep supplying themselves with arms in order to defend themselves, and they had developed a taste for European trade goods, which they were no longer willing to do without. Thus, they start running up enormous debts with European traders. As those debts start spiraling out of control, the Tuscaroras can tell that they're going to be next. That when they can't pay up, when their debts become outstanding beyond the point to which Europeans are willing to tolerate, the Europeans are going to make an alliance with another slaving nation to target the Tuscaroras. Now, in that particular case, North Carolina survives the war despite early losses at the hands of the Tuscaroras and their native allies by virtue of South Carolina enlisting a roster of militant slaving nations to target the Tuscaroras. And South Carolina enlists these groups in no small degree by plying them with arms. But it's only a few years later before those very same groups, Yamasees, Catawbas, Lower Creeks, Cherokees, and the like, realized that the reasons that the Tuscaroras had risen up were now shared by themselves, that they had become desperate debtors to Carolina traders and were likely the next targets for slave attacks. And the breaking point comes when South Carolina, in what I really would characterize as a ham-handed policy, decides to take a census of its slaving Indian allies, which the natives interpret as a first step towards enslaving them all. And thus, over the course of several days, they kill all the Carolina traders in their communities and then set South Carolina under attack.
Fears about firearms, enslavement, and even Native American autonomy were prevalent during the 18th century. And they weren't just limited to the East Coast either. In fact, fear, guns, and ammunition played central roles in driving Native American peoples further west, in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions, to rebel against British authority between 1763 and 1768. And after we take just a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, we will explore the roles that these fears and guns played in an event we now call Pontiac's Rebellion.